March 5, 1971, 5,000 feet above the Mojave Desert. Dean Martin's private Learjet. Tail number N7M. The flight had been smooth, Los Angeles to Las Vegas, a trip Dean made twice a week, 45 minutes in the air, usually uneventful, 7 people on board, Dean in his usual seat, third row window, glass of apple juice in the cup holder, magazine open on his lap, not reading it, just looking at the pictures, the way he always did on short flights. Mack Gray, Dean's assistant, sat across the aisle, going through papers, booking confirmations, schedule adjustments, the usual logistics of keeping Dean Martin's life organized. 2 backup singers in the row behind Dean, Carol and Rita, young women who'd been working Dean's Vegas show for 6 months, talking quietly, laughing about something. The cabin was comfortable, the kind of comfortable that comes from flying private, space to move, no crowds, no strangers, except there was a stranger, row 5. Near the back, a man nobody remembered inviting, Robert Duvall Hayes, 34 years old, unemployed, former aircraft mechanic, fired 3 months earlier for erratic behavior. He'd talked his way onto the plane at LAX, told the ground crew he was Dean's guest, showed them a forged credential. They'd believed him because people who work around celebrities learn not to question too hard. Someone's always showing up claiming to be expected. Hayes had a duffel bag, standard carry-on. Nobody checked it. Nobody had reason to. This was 1971. Airport security was minimal. Private planes had even less. You showed up. You got on. That was it. Hayes had been sitting quietly since takeoff, staring at the back of Dean's head, not reading, not talking, just staring. 20 minutes into the flight, he stood up, unzipped the duffel bag, pulled out a .38 revolver, chrome finish, fully loaded, and pointed it at the cockpit door. "We're going to Cuba." His voice cut through the cabin noise, through the engine hum, through the quiet conversations. Everyone froze. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, shaking. Professional training trying to override terror. "Sir, please sit down and we can discuss this." Hayes fired 1 shot into the ceiling. The sound in the small cabin was deafening, ears ringing. The bullet punched through the interior panel, not breaching the hull, but close enough. The cabin depressurized slightly, a hissing sound. Pressure change making ears pop. Carl screamed. Rita dove behind her seat. Mack Gray's face went white, papers scattering from his lap. The co-pilot, Dave Richardson, appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Hands up. Easy, easy. We can go wherever you want." Hayes swung the gun toward him. "Tell the pilot, Cuba." Now? The pilot, Jim Morrison, not the singer, different guy, had been getting that question his whole career, came over the intercom again. "Sir, we don't have enough fuel to reach Cuba from our current position. We'd need to land and refuel Bach, then land." Hayes screamed. "We're going to Cuba and nobody's stopping us." The gun was shaking in his hand, not from fear, from adrenaline, from whatever chemical imbalance was driving this, from desperation. Everyone in that cabin understood they were 30,000 feet in the air with an armed man who wasn't thinking clearly. No way out, no way to run, no way to fight. Trapped, and then Dean Martin's voice. Calm, almost quiet, but clear enough that everyone heard it. "Sit down with me." The cabin went silent. Hayes turned, looked at Dean. Dean was still in his seat, still holding his magazine, still completely calm, not standing, not moving toward Hayes, just sitting there, looking at the man with the gun like he'd looked at 1,000 other people, with that particular Dean Martin expression that was part amusement, part indifference, part something else nobody could quite name. "What?" Hayes said. "Sit down?" Dean repeated. He gestured to the empty seat next to him. "Have a drink with me. We'll talk about Cuba." Hayes stared. The gun still pointed forward, still shaking. "I said Sati Dodo Nyth me." Dean's voice hadn't gotten louder, but something in the tone had changed. Not aggressive, not commanding, just certain, like a man who knew exactly what was going to happen next and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Hayes took a step forward, then another. The gun lowered slightly, not down, just not pointed at anyone specifically. He moved into the eisel, walked slowly toward Dean's row, and sat down in the seat next to him, the gun still in his hand, resting on his lap now. Still loaded, still dangerous, but not pointed. Dean closed his magazine, set it aside, picked up his glass of apple juice, took a sip, then looked at Hayes. "What's your name?" Hayes's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Robert." "Robert," Dean repeated, like he was testing how the name sounded. "But you knew that." Hayes nodded, still holding the gun, still trembling. "Why Cuba, Robert?" And just like that, at 30,000 feet, in a depressurized cabin with a loaded gun between them, Don Martin and Robert Duvall Hayes started talking. Nobody knew what Dean said during those 20 minutes. Nobody knew how he kept his voice so calm. Nobody knew what words he used to talk an armed man down from the edge. The other passengers could see them talking, could see Hayes crying at one point, could see the gun slowly being set down on the seat between them, could see Den's hand, steady, unhurried, reaching over and picking it up. But the words stayed private. The conversation stayed between two men, until the FFA declassified the incident report 40 years later, and the passengers decided the silence had lasted long enough. The year 1971 was not a year in which airplane hijackings were abstract fears. They were a documented, recurring reality that had been building for a decade. The Cuba connection was specific. Throughout the 1960s, individuals seeking asylum, individuals fleeing criminal charges, individuals with nowhere else to go had seized aircraft and demanded pilots fly them to Havana. The numbers were staggering by the standards of any other period in aviation history. The federal response had been chaotic, the security measures inadequate, the airline industry resistant to the costs of prevention. By 1971, the word hijacking had become part of the ordinary American vocabulary in a way that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The most famous hijacking of that year, D.B. Cooper's extortion of Northwest Orient Flight 305 in November, his parachute exit into the Pacific Northwest night with $200,000 in ransom, was still 8 months in the future when Hayes boarded Dean's Learjet in March. But the atmosphere that made Cooper's audacity possible, the combination of minimal security and widespread knowledge that hijackings could succeed, was already fully established. Private planes were even more vulnerable than commercial flights. The security theater that commercial airlines performed was largely absent from private aviation. You owned a plane. You decided who flew with you, and the ground crew at private terminals operated on trust rather than systematic verification. It was the environment Hayes had studied. He'd worked on private planes for 7 years. He understood exactly where the gaps were. Dean Martin's relationship with his Learjet was the relationship of a man who had found, in private aviation, the one form of travel that gave him genuine control over his time. Commercial flights between Los Angeles and Las Vegas were adequate, but operated on schedules that didn't accommodate the irregular rhythms of a performer's life. Shows ran late. Recording sessions extended past midnight. The private plane meant Dean could leave when the work was done. He'd been flying the route privately for years by 1971, often twice a week, accumulating the comfortable familiarity with a journey that makes the journey itself disappear. You board, you sit, you arrive, and the time in between is simply the interval between one place and another. Mack Gray was almost always with him. Gray had been with Dean for decades, the kind of loyalty that outlasts contract negotiations and career phases, the kind of assistant who knew what was needed before being asked. The backup singers Carol and Rita were newer additions, brought along because Dean's schedule allowed it, and they had rehearsal the following morning. The plane was an extension of Dean's working life, a small controlled environment where the performance could be set aside and Dino Crossetti could exist for 40 5 minutes between one obligation and the next. Hayes's presence had violated that environment in the most extreme way available. Robert Duvall Hayes had been unraveling for longer than the 3 months between his firing and the hijacking. The firing was the visible event, the moment the external world registered that something was seriously wrong. But the deterioration had been gradual, years in the building. He'd been a skilled mechanic. The people who'd worked alongside him before the erratic behavior confirmed it, said he'd had an instinctive understanding of aircraft systems that some people develop through years of practice and some simply have. The job had organized his life. When it was gone, the organization went with it. His wife had left before the firing, had seen the deterioration coming before it expressed itself at work, had made the calculation that the person she'd married was no longer reliably present. The apartment had gone when the paycheck stopped. By March 1971, Hayes was staying with a cousin who'd made clear the arrangement was temporary, living inside a shrinking radius of options. What investigators could trace was the specific fixation on Dean Martin. Hayes had been a casual fan for years, owned a few records, had seen one television special. But in the months after losing his job, the fixation had intensified. Dean Martin represented something Hayes probably couldn't articulate even to himself. A version of ease, of effortless belonging, of a man for whom life had arranged itself around his gifts rather than against his limitations. The flight manifest had come to Hayes through a contact at LAX he'd maintained from his mechanic days. He'd had it for 4 days before the flight. He'd spent those 4 days moving toward something that probably didn't look like a plan even inside his own mind. More like a direction, a way forward when all the other directions had closed. People who heard about what happened on N714DM that March morning constructed their explanations for how it had ended without disaster. Nobody outside the plane knew the full story. The FAA had suppressed the incident report. The passengers had signed agreements. Dean had said nothing publicly. But fragments circulated. 8 theories developed and persisted, and all 8 were wrong in ways that revealed what people expected from crisis situations and from Dean Martin specifically. The first theory was that Dean had offered Hayes money, that the resolution had been a transaction, cash for the gun. This theory was wrong. Dunn had no significant cash on the plane, and Hayes wasn't motivated by money. The second theory was that Dean had physically overpowered Hayes, that at some point he'd made a move, grabbed for the gun. This theory was wrong. Dean had not moved from his seat until Hayes was already beside him and the gun already lowered. The third theory gave the pilots credit, suggested that the visible conversation in the cabin was incidental, that professional aviation protocols had resolved the crisis and Dean had been a bystander. This theory was wrong. The pilots had been fully prepared to fly toward Cuba until Dean spoke. The fourth theory held that Hayes's gun wasn't loaded, that the whole thing had been a bluff and Dean had called it. The gun was loaded. The ceiling shot proved it. The theory was wrong. The fifth theory proposed that Dean had used celebrity manipulation, had deployed the Dean Martin persona, the charm, essentially given Hayes a private performance that worked on a fan. This misunderstood what Dean had done. He'd done the opposite of performing. He'd been more honest with Hayes than in most public interactions. The theory was wrong. The sixth theory suggested Hayes had a fan moment that overwhelmed his hijacking logic and had basically talked himself down while Dean provided a willing ear. This got the mechanism backwards. The theory was wrong. The seventh theory credited the co-pilot Richardson, suggested he'd done something decisive before Dean's intervention could matter. Richardson had handled the situation professionally. He had not been the decisive factor. The theory was wrong. The eighth theory gave Mack Gray a role, suggested Gray had communicated something to Hayes through gesture that supported what Dean was doing. Gray spent the crisis frozen with papers scattered around him. The theory was wrong, all wrong. The truth was simpler and harder than any of them. This wasn't just Dean Martin being calm during a crisis. This wasn't just the famous composure of a man who'd spent 40 years maintaining equilibrium in difficult rooms. This was about what happens when someone decides, in the middle of the most extreme situation life can offer, that treating a desperate person like a human being matters more than calculating the safest path through the danger. Dunn had every reason to stay silent, to let the pilots handle it, to protect himself through invisibility the way every other person in that cabin was doing. Instead, he said 4 words. And the 4 words were not a tactic. They were not a negotiation strategy. They were simply what the moment required, offered by a man who had spent enough years observing human beings to understand what he was looking at. Nobody knew what Dean said during those 20 minutes. The conversation had happened in a space too small and too private for anyone else to fully enter. The FAA had buried the report. The passengers had kept their agreements. Dean had returned to Las Vegas and his schedule without mentioning to anyone that the previous Tuesday he'd talked an armed hijacker into surrendering a loaded gun. If stories like this matter to you, the moments when someone chooses compassion under pressure, when calm becomes the most powerful thing in a room. Subscribe now. There's an entire Dean Martin playlist of these moments, the accounts that emerged in the years after March 15, 1971. Slowly, cautiously, as NDA obligations faded in memory and legal concerns expired, built the picture of the event from its edges inward. Mack Gray spoke about the flight in a 1985 interview, and devoted several careful minutes to describing the crisis without revealing the specific content of the conversation. He described being paralyzed, not a word Gray used for himself often, and looking across the easel at Dean to see a quality of stillness he had never encountered in 40 years of working alongside the man. Not frozen stillness, active stillness. The stillness of someone who had assessed the situation completely and was operating from that assessment. He said Dean saved them. Said it simply, without elaboration. Carol gave a longer account in 1995 to a journalist working on a piece about aviation safety. She described the 20 minutes from her position behind the seats. Crouched, terrified, aware of the conversation happening ahead of her, but unable to hear the words, only the tones. She said Dean's voice throughout was so steady that at some point during those 20 minutes she had stopped believing they were all going to die. Not because anything visible had changed, because his voice had told her something her rational mind couldn't confirm. She said she had never been that frightened, and that the thing that brought her back from the edge of complete panic was the sound of Dean talking like it was Tuesday afternoon. Because it was. Jim Morrison, the pilot, gave the most detailed external account in a 2000 interview for an aviation industry publication. He described the moment Hayes fired the ceiling shot, the immediate calculation he'd begun about whether Cuba was reachable with his fuel load, the radio contact with air traffic control he'd initiated. He said he had been preparing to turn south when Dean's voice came through the cabin. He said he'd watched on the cabin camera as Hayes walked to Dean's row and sat down. He said the next 20 minutes were the longest of his career. The FAA investigator assigned to the case after the 2011 declassification said that from a crisis negotiation standpoint, what Dean Martin had done was textbook in structure and extraordinary in execution. Textbook because the fundamental approach, establishing personal connection, asking questions, listening rather than arguing, meeting desperation with humanity rather than authority, was exactly what trained negotiators were taught. Extraordinary because Dean had no training, had simply recognized what the situation required and provided it. Nobody knew for 4 decades the content of those 20 minutes. Nobody knew what had been said between Dean Martin and Robert Hayes that had moved a man from the edge of something irreversible back to something survivable. The silence had been thorough and well maintained, the product of legal agreements, personal discretion, and Dean's consistent refusal to use his own courage as public material. The story existed as confirmed fact without confirmed content. Until the files opened, if you were on that plane in 1971, trapped at 30,000 feet, no way out, the only thing between you and disaster being one person staying calm, what would you want that person to do? Would you want tactics, physical courage, or would you want what Dean gave: honesty, a voice that treated the moment as survivable, an invitation that assumed the man with the gun was still a man who could be reached? If you want to know what Dean said to Robert Hayes, the words that made a hijacker put down a loaded gun, subscribe. The full conversation is coming when the FAA declassified the incident report in 2011. The reconstruction of Dean's conversation with Robert Hayes became public record. Not a recording. No recording equipment existed on private planes in 1971, but a reconstruction based on Hayes' testimony to federal investigators, corroborated by the passengers who heard fragments. Dean had started simple. "Why Cuba, Robert?" Hayes answered immediately, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "Because there's nothing here," Hayes said. "No job, no future, no point. In Cuba, maybe I could start over." Dean nodded, didn't argue, didn't challenge the logic, just nodded like that made sense. "You know how to fly?" Dean asked. Hayes looked confused. "What? You know how to fly a plane?" Dean said. "You said you're an aircraft mechanic." "I just fixed them," Hayes said. "Then how were you planning to get back if Cuba didn't work out?" Hayes stared. The question was so practical, so matter of fact, that it cut through whatever script he'd been running. "I wasn't planning to come back," Hayes said quietly. Dean took another sip of apple juice. "That's a one-way ticket then." "Yeah, must be pretty bad here if you're willing to never come back." Hayes' eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand." "Maybe not," Dean said, "but I've got 20 minutes before we need to land somewhere. You want to help me understand?" And Hayes talked about losing his job, about his wife leaving, about the apartment he couldn't afford, about lying awake feeling like the world had moved on without him and he was just taking up space, about seeing Dean Martin's name on a flight manifest and thinking, in whatever broken logic his mind was operating under, that hijacking Dean Martin's plane would make people pay attention, would make him matter. Dean listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions, just listened. When Hayes finished, Dean was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You know what I am, Robert?" Hayes shook his head. "I'm a singer," said. "That's it. I'm not special. I'm not important. I'm just a guy from Ohio who learned to sing and got lucky." "You're Dean Martin," Hayes said. Like the name was an argument. "That's a character I play," Dean said. "It's not who I am. Who I am is Dino Crossetti. And Dino spent a lot of years feeling exactly like you described, like the world was moving and he was stuck." "What changed?" Hayes asked. "Nothing changed," Dean said. "I just stopped waiting for the world to care whether I was stuck. I started moving on my own." Hayes looked at the gun on the seat between them. "It's too late for that." "It's not," Dean said. "You haven't hurt anyone. You fired one shot into foam padding. Nobody's bleeding. The plane's fine. You're fine." "I pulled a gun on a plane," Hayes said. "They're going to put me in prison." "Probably," Dean agreed. "But you'll get out eventually, and when you do, you'll still have the chance to move." Cuba wasn't going to fix anything, Robert. Different place, same you. Same problems. Just in Spanish. Hayes laughed, a broken sound, half-sob. "You're telling me to give up?" "I'm telling you this doesn't work," Dean said. "What you're trying to do right now, it doesn't solve what you're trying to solve." "Then what does?" Dean thought about it. "I don't know," he said. But I know forcing other people to pay attention to you doesn't do it. I've been forcing people to pay attention to me for 40 years, and it doesn't fix the inside part. That part you fix yourself or you don't fix it at all." They sat in silence. The plane still flying. The gun still between them. Then Hayes asked, "What happens if I put the gun down?" "You put the gun down," Dean said, "and I pick it up. And we land in Vegas like we were always going to. And you get arrested. And you face what you did. And eventually you get another chance. That's it. That's it." Hayes looked at the gun for a long time. Then he picked it up. Dean didn't move. Hayes held it for a moment, then set it down on the seat closer to Dean. Dean reached over, slowly, calmly, like picking up a magazine, and took it, checked the safety, set it on the floor under his seat, then pressed the call button. "Jim, we're good. Continue to Vegas." The pilot's voice came back, shaking with relief. "Copy that, Mr. Martin." Dean looked at Hayes. "You did the right thing." Hayes was crying, fully crying now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "I know," Dean said. And for the remaining 10 minutes of the flight, Dean sat next to Robert Hayes while a man who had just hijacked a plane wept quietly beside him. To understand why Dean's response to Hayes was not just effective, but genuinely extraordinary, you have to go back to Steubenville, Ohio, and to a childhood shaped by Depression-era working-class life. Dean had grown up watching men who'd run out of options. The Depression had produced them in quantities that made desperation ordinary. Men who'd been skilled workers with stable lives and who'd found themselves, through no personal failure, without the structures that had given their lives shape. Dean had watched those men in his father's barber shop, in the streets of Steubenville, in the conversations that happen between adults when they think children aren't listening. He'd developed an early and lasting understanding of the difference between a man who was dangerous and a man who had been brought to a place where dangerous things seemed like the only remaining options. The distinction was not abstract to him. He'd seen both kinds. He knew what desperation looked like, what it did to the face, what it did to the voice, what it did to the eyes. He'd seen it in Robert Hayes the moment Hayes stood up. Not evil, not malice, desperation wearing the costume of decision. A man who'd reached the end of what he could carry alone and had made the worst available choice because the better ones had been exhausted. Dean's response came from this understanding. He wasn't running a script. He was responding to what he recognized. He'd been seeing this his whole life. The aftermath of the landing at McCarran Airport was efficient and thoroughly bureaucratic. Hayes was taken into federal custody on the jetway before the other passengers deplaned. Dean, Mack Gray, Carol, Rita, and both crew members were interviewed separately by FAA investigators and FBI agents who'd been notified during the flight. The statements were taken. The incident was documented in the dense federal language that makes extraordinary human events look like administrative problems. Den gave his statement completely and without minimizing what Hayes had done or dramatizing what he himself had done. He made a point, according to investigators present, of emphasizing that Hayes had surrendered voluntarily, had not been tricked or physically coerced, had made a genuine decision. This mattered legally. When Hayes's case came to trial, Dean gave testimony in person, which he could have declined, that supported the defense argument that Hayes's mental state warranted consideration in sentencing. Hayes received a sentence reflecting both the seriousness of the offense and its circumstances. He served 8 years of a 12-year sentence, released in 1979. In 1980, he wrote Dean a letter. Dean's response, delivered through his office, was brief and kind. Nobody knew what either letter said. What was known was that Dean had responded at all, had not simply filed the letter with security staff and moved on. Hayes, in the years after his release, rebuilt a life that was smaller and more careful than the one he'd lost, but was a life which was more than March 15, 1971 had seemed to promise. The story of Dean Martin and Robert Hayes at 35,000 feet is not a story about heroism in any conventional sense. Dean did not leap from his seat, did not wrestle a gun from a larger, younger man, did not perform any of the physical actions the word heroism usually summons. What he did was recognize a human being in front of him and respond with the full weight of everything he understood about desperation and the loneliness of men who'd lost their grip on the structures holding their lives together. He did this while sitting in his seat, while holding apple juice, without training, without protocol, without anything except 40 years of watching people carefully and understanding what he saw. The calm that every witness described, Gray's awe, Carroll's panic turning to steadiness, Morrison's relief, was not the calm of indifference or bravado. It was the calm of a man who had seen enough human desperation to understand that it was not the end of the conversation, that there was usually something left to work with, that the person on the other side of the worst moment was still a person. Dean had been performing calm for 40 years. The apple juice in the glass, the stumble calibrated to precision, the slur held at exactly the right level. But what he gave Robert Hayes on March 15, 1971 was not a performance. It was the real thing. The calm that existed beneath all the performing. The Dino Crocetti calm that had been there before Dean Martin existed and would be there after the performance finally stopped. March 15, 1971. 35,000 feet above the Mojave Desert, a hijacker pulled a gun on Dean Martin's plane. Everyone screamed. The pilot prepared to comply. Dean Martin never left his seat. Instead, he said 4 words, "Sit down with me." For 20 minutes, Dean talked to Robert Hayes, not as a celebrity to a criminal, as one human being to another. Hayes put the gun down. The plane landed safely. 7 lives saved. Dean never told this story, never used it for publicity, never claimed to be a hero. He just did what needed to be done, then went back to being Dean. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the moments he chose humanity over self-preservation, the times his calm saved lives, there's an entire playlist waiting. These stories don't stay online forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.